were reached yesterday is that both the oil companies and government need to work together.
Absolutely.
And when you go into a negotiation, it's not about win-win. It's about, rather it's not a win-lose situation, but rather it's a win-win. You must get into a position whereby the government is heard, but also the concerns of the oil companies are heard. I think coming from where Uganda was 2 years ago, when everyone thought nothing was going to happen, it's actually very refreshing and pleasing to see that the parties have come to compromise. And if you also listen to what the president said, he said in 2006 he had engaged the oil companies, indicating that he wanted all the oil to leave this country. What we are seeing happen is that a compromise was reached, and by reaching that compromise, it was agreed that you can have a refinery and have a pipeline. So that really stands out. Oil and gas negotiations, it's about moderation, compromise. Extremism has no room, and I think the government and oil companies have handled that well. Well, in some instances, their positions have been over the board, both the oil companies and the government, probably as a negotiation strategy. But ultimately, we are at a point where finally Uganda's oil and gas project is taking off. Now, Uganda made a discovery in 2006. And I mean, a discovery of oil is good enough. But unless that oil is monetized, it remains in the ground. Now, how do you monetize the oil? You monetize the oil either by having in place a refinery that is going to break down that crude oil into refined products that can be used like fuel for cars. Or, if you do not have a refinery, by having a market where you can sell the crude oil. Now, to be able to sell the crude oil, because Uganda is a landlocked country, you need to have a pipeline. And that pipeline involves another country with whom negotiations have got to happen. But further to that, by the time oil was discovered in Uganda, Uganda had an old oil law, which was not up to date with the realities of the time. Uganda lacked infrastructure. And then also the expectations gap, because back then, if a country ever made a discovery, everyone suddenly thought you're going to become the next Saudi Arabia. So expectations at the time when oil was found were so high. Reality has only sunk in. But then also the considerations, economic considerations, today and then are different. Oil was discovered in Uganda when the price per barrel was over $100, and projections suggested that oil could even reach $200 per barrel. It's not the case anymore. There are questions around whether the oil and gas industry is still going to be as dominant as it was. So we are at that level, and it's quite refreshing that a decision has been taken at this point in time. Otherwise, there were fears by some people that probably the country could lose out. And if the country lost out at that point in time, no one would really forgive the current government. So it's been a long journey to get to where we've gotten. Because in the first place, to get someone to explore, to find whether there's oil, you need to enter into a license or an agreement, which is what we call a production sharing agreement. And that agreement gives them the permission to actually undertake exploration in accordance with the law of the land. But once you've entered into that agreement, now you need to undertake the actual drilling works. The drilling works, to ascertain whether oil exists, would necessitate you bringing into the country machinery and equipment. Now just imagine where oil was first found in Bulisa or Hoima. At that point in time when guys were going to do the exploration, no roads ever existed. So roads had to be cleared on an ad hoc basis to enable some equipment to reach there, to clear the bushes where you would actually go and drill to establish whether oil has been found. Now after oil has been found, the next big hurdle is whether it actually makes commercial sense for you to proceed. And the decision of commerciality depends on what you project would be the cost you're going to spend, and what you think would be the revenue you're going to earn, and how you're going to share that revenue between the government and the oil companies. Is the sharing fair to enable a project to make an economic return? Because as a shareholder of Total and Sinop, all they are looking at is that if we invest in Uganda, are we going to earn wealth on our capital? So those considerations also come into place. And that is why the negotiations have been protracted. Because on the other hand, the government has been saying, you know what, we need to get the most for our oil so that the citizens benefit. But also the oil companies have been contending that indeed we have to ensure that our shareholders have a fair return. So negotiating these commercial terms to align the objectives of both the government and the oil companies has not been a tall order. And I would like to congratulate the government and the oil companies for having undertaken these negotiations. It's not been easy. We've been putting you under pressure. Some of us have been quite vocal, sometimes saying you're probably too greedy, you want so many taxes.
Yeah.
But I mean, you've really done very well, and valuable lessons have been picked, and I'm pretty sure that subsequent negotiations of such a scale would be a little bit easier than it has been today, because now there's a real appreciation of the dynamics that go into negotiations.
Right.
Now, when you finish those negotiations, it's at that point that you're able to determine and put pen to paper the arguments that, yes, indeed, it now makes sense for me to actually to proceed and invest. So that is the point at which Uganda is. All the agreements that are required have been finalized. And after finalizing of those agreements, what remains is merely a formality of declaration, because the preliminaries have done. And as you heard from yesterday, now the oil companies have been given a go-ahead to formally contract the vendors who are going to build the pipeline. So after that has been done, the next stage will be a formality. I do not expect we are going to have a next big ceremony like we had yesterday. Yesterday was fanfare. It was a day of celebration where all the heavy hitters were in. You had the president of Tanzania, you had Total Global president and CEO, you had CNOC president and all the players celebrating this milestone. The rest that would remain is really going to be low-key. Now I'm going to get to that, but I would like to first comment about what you've said, that FID has been long overdue. Well, I think in terms of the fact that oil was discovered in 2006, and we are only getting to a level or a point of building the infrastructure, indeed, it's taken a bit of time. And many times people like to cite the example of Ghana, that Ghana discovered oil almost at the same time as Uganda, but they were able to produce oil 3 years subsequently. Of course, the dynamics are different. The discovery in Kenya is offshore. When I say offshore, that is a discovery made in the water, in the ocean. In Uganda, the discovery was made inland, okay, in a remote place that did not have infrastructure. And you had to negotiate having place in the pipeline. But for Ghana, for as long as you made a discovery, all you had to do was to put there a floating platform, production platform, and then bring the ships, and then plug in, and then they get to oil. Yet for us, you have to build a pipeline through to Tanga, and then when you have a pipeline at Tanga, that is where the tankers are going to be found. Okay. Now, in terms of readiness, is Uganda really ready? It's taken 15 years of government negotiating. It's taken 15 years of government putting in place the infrastructure and regulations and the legislative framework. It's taken 15 years for government to establish institutions that are managing the oil and gas industry. Fortunately, the Petroleum Authority, the regulator, I think has now been in place for about 7 years. Was it from 2014? The Ghana National Oil Company has also been in place for nearly about the same amount of time. They've staffed well. They're well staffed, and they are continuing to ramp up employment activities. So you would expect that in terms of capacity to regulate and manage the sector, Uganda should be ready. Of course, when we are at a point where now Uganda has got to dip its pockets, to dip its hand into the pockets and commit financially. And if you've seen in the last 2 weeks, the government has been before Parliament trying to ask that it is given authority to actually borrow, because by borrowing, they will be able to foot commitments to the financial requirements needed for the project. And I think government was given some formal approval to actually go and borrow. And so they should be able to have the initial money required to kickstart some of these major projects. So that is the government on the financial side. The oil companies also have to foot their contributions. I believe the fact that the people have been at the helm of these negotiations.
They should have prepared beforehand.
They should have prepared for that. Now, the other issue is the local people. Are the local people prepared for the opportunities that are going to come? Of course, back then there was a lot of excitement. But you know what? Have to prepare for the opportunities. Oil and gas is the next big thing. And some daring entrepreneurs took decisions that came back to haunt them. So until where we are, people have been hesitant now to invest in light of the experiences they've gone through. So Whether they are ready could be another issue. But the way I look at it is that in light of the decision made yesterday, it doesn't mean that construction is going to start today or it's going to start tomorrow. It's probably going to take another 6 to 9 months because it's now at the point of awarding contracts to the major companies. Now, when these are multinationals, which do not even have companies in Uganda, so they have to set up locally, they have to find offices, and after they've set up locally, they are going to subcontract further segments of the contracts they got. So Ugandan companies now have a chance and room and role to participate in those opportunities. And I don't think it's really late because it's a question of scaling up. Oil and gas doesn't consume unique items. Oil and gas, when you're building the production facilities, you need cement. You need steel.
And we have companies doing all that
yes,
here.
We have companies which are doing that. Of course, it's at a scale, a higher scale. Maybe the companies may not be able to provide in the quantities required, so they may have to scale up. So I believe there are already some existing transferable business skills which can easily be scaled up to meet the oil and gas needs. And if you have between 6 to 9 months to prepare for that opportunities, I can't really say that the local entrepreneurs are not ready for that. To get to this level, the legislative and commercial framework is fully sorted and aligned. In 2013, new oil laws were passed. And therefrom, all activities in relation to Uganda's oil and gas industry have been conducted under the Petroleum Exploration, Production and Development Act of 2013. Further to that, because Uganda needed to have a pipeline with Tanzania, the two countries had to negotiate the general framework under which they would conduct this exploration, rather the building of the pipeline. So in 2017, the intergovernmental agreement was negotiated and concluded between Tanzania and Uganda. Now what had to follow there was negotiating a host government agreement between the government of Uganda and the oil companies in Uganda, and then another one between the government of Tanzania and the oil companies in Tanzania. That has been done. And yesterday, one of the agreements that were initialed, rather signed, was the host government between Uganda and the oil companies. Tanzania did not sign off theirs, but there's no outstanding issue. Okay. It's expected that sooner than later, that agreement will actually be signed off. Then further to that, because the pipeline company has a number of players into it, including the Uganda National Oil Company, the Tanzania Petroleum Development Corporation, and then the other oil companies, the parties in between themselves had to agree a shareholder agreement, spelling out their rights and obligations. The shareholder agreement was finished and it was signed yesterday. But more to that, the pipeline company, which is going to be set up, had to enter into a separate agreement with the different oil companies. And that pipeline company, that is what they call a tariff and transportation agreement, essentially sets out parameters of the commercial terms under which the oil is going to be transported and the fees to be paid. That agreement is difficult to negotiate. It has been negotiated and it was signed yesterday. So when you look at everything that is required in terms of legislation and commercial agreements, they are all in place. And that is why the statement which came out yesterday was to the effect that the project is ready to take off. We've launched the project. Of course, there's only one outstanding issue. That is the bill. All the agreements relating to the pipeline have got to be codified into law. And the Minister of Energy in Uganda yesterday, Honorable Kikitutu, spoke about the fact that she's shortly tabling before Uganda's parliament the East Africa Crude Oil Pipeline Act bill. We do not expect that this will be contested in parliament, because all the issues which are more or less reflected in that bill are a replication of the issues that have already been negotiated in the agreements. Okay.
All right, so that shows that we prepared for this beforehand.
And actually all the disputes which have arisen between the government and the oil companies were in relation to negotiations that were happening for all those agreements and the laws. Where the government was going overboard, the oil companies would come up and say, no, we don't agree to that. And where the oil companies were going overboard, the government would also come up and say that, that is not pro-Uganda, or this is not pro-Tanzania. The oil and gas industry is an intricate one. It's an industry that has periods of boom and busts. It's not every day that oil prices will trade at $100. And it's not every day that oil prices will trade at $50.
But you agree with me that they've been suffering?
Yeah, because of the fundamentals which can be explained. The fundamental issue of demand and supply.
Okay.
Now, during COVID times, oil prices collapsed. The reason why they collapsed is that the entire world went on lockdowns. Cars were not moving. The factories closed, the refineries. So clearly there was no way that oil would be utilized. So the demand was wiped away. But even more to that, if you heard about the shale revolution, the shale oil revolution from 2014, American companies devised another way of finding oil in the shale rocks by doing what they call fracking. And because of that fracking, there was a lot of oil that flooded the market. In fact, America became, previously it was a net import of oil, but it became a net exporter. And I don't know, many people don't know that actually America is the biggest producer of oil and gas.
Oh.
So the supply was not matching the demand because there was a supply glut. There was so much in excess of the demand. And fundamentally, if what you produce is more than what is required, certainly prices would fall. But what that means is that when prices go low, the investment reduces. When prices go low, some projects require significantly higher costs. So it would mean that for the project to go on stream, you need to have prices when a bit high. So oil companies have cut back on their investment. And the thing about oil and gas, it's not that when you invest today, you will start to produce tomorrow. As you've just spoken, even if we are taking a decision to build a pipeline and start building the other necessary infrastructure, it might take us between 3 to 4 years before you bring it on stream. So even if oil prices just increased today to $100, or they increased in the second year, it would mean that projects which are sanctioned then would get to production after 5 or 6 years. So the future is not bad. This is something which can be explained. In fact, because of the scaled back investment, it's projected that the next 3 to 4 years, there's going to be a drastic fall.
So speaking to the entrepreneurs, it should be a long-term investment
yes,
that they need to look at.
Yes, oil and gas is long-term. It's not short-term. And even when the oil companies are planning, when they are doing scenario economic models, they know that, you know what, worst case scenario, oil prices might fall up to 40, and then best scenario, oil prices might rise up to 90, and then you average it out.
Okay.
And then that is the basis for you to determine that indeed it's profitable or not. So oil and gas is not a short-term business. Don't go into it when you want to
expect money tomorrow.
It's a bit of gambling. And without a doubt, there's an energy transition in place. But that energy transition does not mean that oil and gas is going to be dumped. What that energy transition has shown us is that you're reducing dependency on the fossils. Because previously, everything depended on the oil and gas industry.
Yeah.
Which was not really good in terms of the environmental
conservation, absolutely.
Pollution. But by and large, now it's diversification, move to cleaner sources of energy as a means of reducing the pressure. Now, what is projected is that the demand, the growth of demand for the oil and gas consumption will decelerate. But it doesn't mean that they're going to stop using oil and gas. If you know it very well, coal is one of the biggest polluters. People have red flagged coal and suggested that we shouldn't use any coal anymore. Go to China, go to UK, go to South Africa, go to US, they still use coal. So even for oil and gas, dependence might reduce, but it's the most convenient source of energy as it is at the moment.
All right. You talked about the fact that there is already some vendors that have already, shown their contendency in getting contracts for the E-Corp. Now, what should be the considerations so that we remain with our interests as priority?
Probably before I answer that, the question of vendors, I've remembered there's another issue which I need to spell out.
Okay.
When people are looking at the oil and gas industry, they imagine that oil is only used for fueling cars. But it's also the petrochemical industry.
Oh,
that
absolutely.
paint you see on this building, it's a product of oil.
Cosmetics.
The clothes you're wearing, the cosmetics, fertilizers. So if the world is to continue having these things, crude oil is going to remain a feedstock, a raw material that would be required. Okay. So we still have some time. The plastics, it's a product of a refinery. So we still have a bit of time. And then there are also political considerations. Just like it's a trade-off, because you have a country to feed. You have people for whom you must create opportunities. So if you over-glorify the environment, and you take a decision that we're not going to build anything, because when you build anything, you disturb the environment, how are you going to feed the people? How are you going to create opportunities? And we've seen this happen in the US. The Democrats are pro-environment. And in the last debate that US presidential candidates had, President Biden jumped onto that and said this guy wants to stop the oil and gas industry. He had to come out and say, no, we're not stopping the oil and gas industry. It will continue. So there are also those political considerations. So would you rather not have the oil and gas industry when people are getting out of jobs, or you find a way of balancing?
Absolutely.
And I think that's what the oil companies are doing. They still produce oil and gas, but they are going into other sources of energy to reduce dependency. Now, local content is at the forefront of the oil and gas industry. Uganda has local content rules. And the idea behind local content is maximizing local opportunities, so that a lot of the activities take place in the economy, so that there's a multiplier effect and impact. So Uganda's local content rules are quite robust, and we hope that the Petroleum Authority of Uganda will actually be strong enough to enforce these rules. So if PAO, the regulator, enforces these rules, you can expect that there are checklists which have got to be ticked. The level of Ugandans who are employed, the level of raw materials which are being consumed. If goods and services are not locally available, at least ensure that you do that in concert with a joint venture. And and then also supplier development. The oil companies and their major contractors have to pen down a plan that shows how they are going to help Ugandan companies which are showing potential but do not have potential. And then also there are requirements that even if a contract is so big, but unbundle it, break it down into pieces that can be palatable by growing Ugandan businesses. Don't just say, no, Ugandan businesses don't have money, they don't have capacity. Try to go the extra mile to ensure that locals indeed benefit. And this is the mandate of PAO, to enforce this. If PAO does its work very well, I'm not really worried that Ugandans will not benefit. I know the oil and gas industry is technical, but I remember when the minister went to Parliament last week, but one, parliamentarians came out and said, how come Uganda is taking such a small share?
Yeah.
The greatest wealth in the industry is created at production.
Okay.
Where Uganda has the biggest stake. The reason why we are having this crude oil pipeline is just to convey the oil out. It's just a means of ensuring that the oil reaches to the market. And even when you look at the projections of the profitability of the pipeline company, it's not that very profitable. Because the pipeline is going to take 3.5 billion to build. That is a necessary cost. If you do not have a conveyor belt for this oil, your oil will never go out of the ground. So the 3.5 billion has to be incurred. Now the 3.5 billion is either borrowed or is funded by Ugandan and other stakeholders. Now, if Uganda took 100% stake in the pipeline, that meant it had to raise the $3.5 billion. If Uganda took 30%, it meant it had to raise 30%.
Okay.
So they would have to borrow more money. And why do you have to borrow more money for a project that is actually not even very profitable? So
Makes
concentrate
sense.
where the value is, where the production is. And that is where Uganda is concentrating. And to allay people's fears, when we do some projections herein, Uganda direct receipts of revenues is likely to get over 70% of the entire wealth which has been created by the sector. That is not a bad deal. Remember, there's also going to be a multiplier effect. People are going to be employed, Uganda will be collecting taxes, other businesses will grow, and then you're also opening up. By doing these projects, you're encouraging more exploration. Because now the cost of developing future fields becomes cheap. When someone discovers oil now, you don't have to build another pipeline. You would not have to build another refinery. It never takes off. You simply plug in. So let's pray, or we should even encourage future exploration, because any discovery that is now made will mean a super win for Uganda, because there'll be no more costs incurred. They've already been incurred. Like the president spoke yesterday, some portion of it might be refined. So there are ongoing engagements to ensure that the refinery comes on stream. Of course, initially the Russians had been awarded that concession to come and build a refinery, but they pulled out. And now there's another consortium in place, which has Yatra, Saipem, and GE, and Lions Works, who are trying to put together a structure and financing. So if that ever works, you'll also have some refinery here, refining the oil, and then the other oil will be exported. But even if
it's good for
even if that were not the case, you cannot use all the oil.
Absolutely.
Local demand is less than 50,000 barrels per day. East Africa demand is less than 100,000 barrels per day. You're producing at peak 230,000 barrels per day. So there would be an excess. Where would you take that excess? Would you
Absolutely.
Want to or export it? From the perspective of government, they feel a refinery makes a lot more sense because you lock out, you save the import bill. From the perspective of the oil companies, they believe it makes more sense to export the oil. And the argument they've been raising is that refineries business makes a lot more if you produce on economies of scale. If you're refining 1 million barrels per day, the unit cost per barrel comes down very significantly, as opposed to when you're refining only 50,000 barrels. So, fortunately, a compromise has been struck. So, if we get financing for the refinery will be built, and the government and the people will be able to harness the opportunities that are believed to emerge out of the refinery. And then there's also a pipeline which meets the expectations and demands of the oil companies.
Correct.
If you recall, when the oil companies they took on a high-pitched note, and the government was also taking on a high-pitched voice note, the negotiations collapsed. And it was a lose-lose for everyone. When they came back on table and everyone was willing to listen to one another and adopted a win-win position, we've actually seen that the project is moving forward. So negotiations, it's about win-win. It's not about win or lose. And I think that's a key lesson that comes out of this. Not only even this, but even in our life lessons, people who tend to succeed most, conveyors of compromise, win-win. And I expect that future negotiations involving very difficult negotiations will be a little bit easier, because the government officials who have negotiated these contracts have picked up a lot of knowledge. Let's be positive that this oil is for every one of us. Let's not be naysayers. The people who are going to benefit from the sector are people who believe they can make it, people who are really enthusiastic. The bit about the oil and gas sector is that the standards cannot be compromised. If you stand out as someone who does good work, as someone who conforms to standards, as someone who respects safety and health standards and who is keen to pursue opportunities, business will come your way. So I encourage everyone to pick interest, especially between now and the next 6 months. It's not late for you. If you're a businessman and you're doing other things, you've been supplying other projects, it's possible that you can actually supply the oil and gas industry if you pick interest. So please pick up those interests, come in. At a macro level, the government has a role to play. They will do the infrastructure, they have to regulate the sector. But even you at a micro level, there's a role for you to play. Be proactive. Proactively look for these opportunities. No one else is going to get them for you. It's you to get this for yourself.